Adam and Eve are driven out of the Garden of Eden. They are banished from God's presence. They have become unfit to be in the presence of God because of their sins. Their sins have made them guilty, but has also made them defiled or unclean, ceremonially impure, and unfit to be in the holy realm. And that's what Eden was. It was the dwelling place of God. And because God dwelt in Eden, it was a holy realm. It was the most holy place on earth. I think it's very important to recognize that, and this is developed later in Scripture clearly. The holiness of Eden. Eden is referred to as the holy mountain of God
Hmm.
in Ezekiel chapter 28,
Right.
and the garden of God. Um, most people don't think of Eden as a mountain, but that's what it was.
Right.
Eden was a mountain, and the Garden of Eden was apparently on the summit of the mountain. And so to ascend Mount Eden to its summit was to ascend into the presence of God, the Holy of Holies, the most
Hmm.
holy place. And that's what Adam was. Adam was a mountain ascending worshiper.
So you
He was a
almost
priest.
should be singing Psalm 125 in anticipation as we ascend up the steps in the temple. And these songs of ascent, there's these constant themes of ascending on high to be present with the Lord. The mountains had that symbolism in the Old Testament, and it's carried on through the New.
Absolutely. And the first mountain, the first holy mountain of God was Mount Eden.
Yeah.
And of course, there's later Mount Sinai,
Mount.
which is a reproduction in a redemptive setting of
Yeah.
Mount Eden. Then there's Mount Zion.
Hmm.
And then, of course, in Hebrews 12 and elsewhere, you have, the invisible mountain,
Yeah. The
the
heavenly
holy
Mount Zion. Hmm.
heavenly Mount Zion. And so the idea of Adam ascending up Mount Eden into the Holy of Holies was symbolic of man's destiny to ascend from earth into heaven,
Right.
and his or to ascend from a state of innocence to a state of glory. And the way he would obtain that ascent was by perfect obedience. And he would obtain it for himself and for all humanity through the perfect personal obedience of a federal head, a covenant head. Humanity would ascend into a state of glory and be glorified and become a living temple of God in which God dwells by his Spirit. And so, Eden, Mount Eden, was a garden temple. And God drove Adam and Eve out of the garden temple, and he closed the gate to his garden temple. And he closed the gate. And this is interesting. You see another clear connection between the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle because of its eastward orientation. Right? He drove them out east of the garden, and he placed at the east of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword. The tabernacle later is going to have an eastward orientation, and the temple, which replaces the tabernacle, also does. So here's a very clear connection between worship in the tabernacle and worship in the Garden of Eden. Whenever the priest went westward into the sanctuary, it was like a return in symbolic typological form into the Garden of Eden. And when the high priest, in particular, one day out of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, entered into the most holy place, he was an Adam-like figure returning into the Garden of Eden, passing beyond the veil on which were woven those cherubim in the tabernacle and later the temple. So there's the exile from the presence of God and the closing of the gate of Eden. The cherubim are now the guardians of the holy realm. They are going to keep out anything that is unclean from being in the holy presence of God. And the flaming sword, of course, represents the wrath of God, which would strike anyone who would reach out his hand to take from the tree of life. Now, of course, Christ, who is that new Adam, who is ultimately that high priest, who does make that atoning sacrifice, passes through that flaming sword and dies in our place in order that he may reach out his hand and take from the tree of life. And he does that as our representative head. But one thing I want to point out here very quickly, this is critical to understanding the story of Cain and Abel. This is the background for the story of Cain and Abel. And we have to keep these things in mind, Genesis 3:15, 3:21, and 3:24 in particular, to make sense of what's going on in the Cain and Abel narrative. Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden east of Eden. The gate is closed, but they are going to worship east of Eden at the gate of Eden. Adam and Eve and their descendants still worship at the holy mountain of God outside of the gate. They worship now uh, in a redemptive way, in keeping with the covenant of grace, which contains a promise of salvation, first announced in verse 15, and also sacramental signs that seal those promises, such as we have an example of in Genesis 3:21, the sacrificial animals.